A poor student tutored a sick child for free, only to learn she was the CEO's daughter. But for Elijah Carter, that realization came much later, long after he'd already fallen in love with the magic of teaching 8-year-old Sophie Williams, whose curious mind seemed to dance even when her body couldn't. Elijah's apartment was the kind of cold that seeped through walls. February in Boston showed no mercy to the building's ancient heating system, which sputtered and wheezed like an asthmatic dragon before giving up entirely most nights. The 22-year-old graduate student huddled at his desk, wrapped in 3 layers of sweaters, his breath forming small clouds as he reviewed his financial spreadsheet for the 5th time that evening. The numbers hadn't changed. They never did, no matter how many times he recalculated. Tuition, $24,680 per semester. Scholarship, $18,000. Student loans, $6,000. Rent, $850 per month. Food, $200 per month if he was careful. Utilities varied, but always too much. His part-time library job covered rent, barely, but the rest was a precarious balancing act. One unexpected expense could topple everything he'd worked for. His shoulders slumped as he closed the laptop, the screen's blue glow disappearing and leaving him in the dim yellow light of his desk lamp. The last text from his mother glowed on his phone. "So proud of you, sweetheart. Dad would be too." He swallowed hard. 3 years since cancer had taken his father, and the weight of his absence still pressed on Elijah's chest some nights, making it hard to breathe. Education had been everything to James Carter. "Knowledge doesn't just open doors, son," he'd often say. "It builds new ones where none existed." His father, a high school math teacher who never made much but gave everything to his students, had left Elijah with little except that belief. And now, halfway through his master's in education at Boston University, Elijah clung to it like a lifeline. The notification sound from his email interrupted his thoughts. Probably another past-due reminder. But the subject line caught his attention. Tutoring opportunity, immediate need. The email was from Professor Harrington, his advisor. "Elijah, I have a rather unusual request. A family needs a tutor for their daughter who is unable to attend school regularly due to a chronic health condition. They need someone with patience and creativity who can adapt to her good days and bad. The position is immediate but temporary, perhaps 2 to 3 months. I thought of you. If interested, contact Dr. Elena Kim at Boston Children's Hospital." Elijah's finger hovered over the delete button. He didn't have time for this. Between classes, his thesis research, and his library job, sleep was already a luxury he could scarcely afford. But something stopped him. Maybe it was his father's voice in the back of his mind. Maybe it was the memory of how James Carter would spend evenings helping struggling students for free. Claiming the payment was in watching the light of understanding dawn in their eyes. With a sigh that turned to mist in the cold air, Elijah replied, "I'm interested. Please provide contact details." 2 days later, he stood in the pristine lobby of Boston Children's Hospital, feeling utterly out of place. His best sweater had a small hole near the cuff that he'd tried to stitch himself, and his coat was worn thin at the elbows. Around him, doctors in crisp white coats and visitors in expensive winter wear made him acutely aware of every frayed thread in his clothing. "Mr. Carter?" A woman in her 40s with kind eyes and silver-streaked black hair approached. "I'm Dr. Kim. Thank you for coming." Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine. As she led him through the hospital corridors, she explained Sophie's situation. She has juvenile idiopathic arthritis with some complications. Her condition flares unpredictably, sometimes leaving her bedridden for days. She's missed too much school, and the home tutors provided by the district haven't connected well with her. Elijah nodded, processing the information. "How old is she?" 8. Bright as they come, but increasingly frustrated by her limitations. She loves science and art, often combines them in interesting ways. They paused outside a room with colorful drawings taped to the door. Each featured fantastical creatures labeled with scientific-sounding names and detailed anatomical notes. Her imagination is expansive. "Dr. Nersanawidorsananimosh," Kim said with a hint of amusement. "I should mention, her mother is often traveling for work. Sophie stays here during severe flares, or with her nurse at home during better periods. You'd be working in both settings." "What about her father?" Elijah asked. Something shifted in Dr. Kim's expression. "Not in the picture. It's just Sophie and her mother." She knocked lightly on the door before opening it. "Sophie? Your tutor is here." The room was transformed into a wonderland of color and light. String lights twinkled across the ceiling, and the walls were covered with artwork and scientific posters. In the midst of it all, a small figure sat cross-legged on the bed, surrounded by books and colored pencils. Sophie Williams had wild curly hair the color of honey and dark, serious eyes that seemed too old for her young face. She wore fuzzy purple socks, pajama pants covered in constellations, and a t-shirt that read, "Future Scientist." She didn't look up immediately, focused on her drawing with an intensity that reminded Elijah of his father grading papers. "Sophie, Doctor," Kim tried again. "I heard you," the girl said, still not looking up. "I'm finishing an important discovery." Elijah's lips twitched. He stepped closer to peek at her drawing, a detailed sketch of what appeared to be a dragon with labeled parts. "Is that the respiratory system?" he asked, genuinely curious. Sophie's head snapped up, eyes narrowing as she assessed him. "Yes, I'm designing a more efficient lung for fire breathing. The current hypothesis about dragon anatomy doesn't account for the sustained combustion necessary for a proper flame." Elijah nodded seriously. "A critical oversight. Have you considered the heat exchange problem?" Her eyes widened slightly. "What heat exchange problem?" "Well," he said, pulling up a chair, "if you're creating that much heat inside a body, you need a way to prevent cooking the dragon's other organs. Most reptiles are ectothermic. Their body temperature changes with their environment." Sophie stared at him for a long moment, then silently pushed a blank paper and pencil toward him. "Show me, Doctor." Kim smiled and quietly left the room as Elijah began sketching a modified circulatory system for a theoretical dragon, complete with specialized cooling chambers and heat-resistant tissues. By the time he left the hospital 2 hours later, he had agreed to tutor Sophie 3 times a week. The pay was modest but welcome, though he would have done it for free just to see the fierce concentration on the girl's face as she absorbed new information like a sponge. What he didn't know then was how Sophie Williams would change everything. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays after his morning classes, Elijah would meet Sophie either at the hospital or at her home in Brookline, depending on her health. The house was surprisingly modest, comfortable but not extravagant, with a lived-in feel that contrasted with the clinical perfection of the hospital room. Mrs. Williams remained an enigma. Always traveling, always working, present only in the framed photos on the walls, and in Sophie's occasional references to Mommy's big meetings or Mommy's business trips. The household was run by Nancy, a no-nonsense nurse in her 50s, who clearly adored Sophie but maintained professional boundaries. The tutoring sessions quickly became the brightest spots in Elijah's week. Sophie was brilliant but impatient, curious but easily frustrated by her physical limitations. On good days, they would conduct experiments in the kitchen or sketch mathematical concepts with sidewalk chalk in the backyard. On bad days, when her joints were too inflamed for her to hold a pencil, he would read to her or create verbal puzzles that kept her mind engaged while her body rested. "Why are you so poor?" Sophie asked one day, 3 weeks into their arrangement. She was having a moderate day, able to sit at the kitchen table but moving stiffly, her small hands slightly swollen. Elijah nearly choked on his water. "What makes you think I'm poor?" Sophie rolled her eyes with the magnificent disdain only children can truly master. "Your sweaters all have holes. You count your change before buying coffee. You bring the same lunch every day. Peanut butter sandwich, apple, and exactly 14 pretzels. You counted my pretzels?" he asked, amused and slightly unnerved by her observation skills. "I'm detail-oriented," she said, echoing what was clearly an adult phrase she'd heard about herself. "Nancy says it's both my best and most annoying quality." Elijah laughed. "Well, I'm not exactly poor. I'm just a student. That means most of my money goes to school." "Why?" "School is boring." "Not all school. And learning is never boring. Just sometimes the way it's taught can be." Sophie considered this, tapping her pencil against her notebook. "My last tutor said I asked too many questions." "No such thing," Elijah replied firmly. "Questions are how we learn." She studied him for a long moment. "My mom asks a lot of questions too. That's how she knows when people are lying to her." Something in her tone made Elijah pause. "Do people lie to your mom often?" Sophie shrugged, wincing slightly at the movement. "Grown-ups lie to each other all the time. Especially to my mom. Nancy says it's because they want things from her." Before he could probe further, she changed the subject abruptly. "I want to learn about stars today. Real ones, not the stupid connect-the-dot constellations in my book." They spent the afternoon exploring astronomy websites. Elijah made mental notes to bring his old telescope next time, a treasured gift from his father that had sparked his own childhood fascination with the cosmos. It wasn't until he was heading home, riding the T back to his neighborhood, that Sophie's words about her mother lingered in his mind. What did an 8-year-old mean about people wanting things from her mom? He pictured the modest house, comfortable but not luxurious. Perhaps her mother was a lawyer or doctor, professions where people might indeed want special treatment. The question faded as more immediate concerns took precedence. His apartment was even colder than usual when he returned. The building's heating system had completely failed, the landlord reported apologetically. It would be at least 3 days before repairs could be made. That night, Elijah slept in his coat, hat, and gloves, buried under every blanket he owned. His dreams were filled with dragons with specialized heating systems and a small girl who counted pretzels and asked too many questions. The following week brought Sophie's worst flare since they'd begun working together. Elijah arrived at the hospital to find her curled on her side, face tight with pain, eyes glassy with medication. "We should reschedule," Nancy suggested quietly at the door. "I heard that," Sophie called weakly from the bed. "No rescheduling. I'm bored." Elijah approached cautiously. "Hey, dragon scientist. Tough day?" A small nod, her honey-colored curls limp against the pillow. "Want me to read to you instead of lessons today?" Another nod. He pulled a book from his backpack, a collection of myths and legends he'd found at the library, specifically chosen for a section on dragons across different cultures. For 2 hours, he read quietly, pausing whenever Sophie's eyes drifted closed, continuing when they fluttered open again. He was midway through a Japanese dragon tale when the door opened. The woman who entered stopped Elijah mid-sentence. She was striking, tall and elegant in a charcoal suit that screamed expensive tailoring, with the same honey-colored hair as Sophie, though hers was cut in a sleek bob. Her eyes, matching Sophie's deep brown, widened slightly at the sight of him. "Mommy!" Sophie's face transformed, pain momentarily forgotten. "Hi, sweetheart." The woman's voice softened as she approached the bed, bending to kiss Sophie's forehead. "I came as soon as my meeting ended." Elijah stood awkwardly, book in hand. "I should go. You must be the tutor," the woman said, turning her full attention to him. Her gaze was assessing, almost uncomfortably perceptive. Elizabeth Williams, Sophie's mother. Her handshake was firm, professional. Up close, Elijah could see the subtle signs of exhaustion beneath her polished exterior. Faint shadows under her eyes, tension in her shoulders. Elijah Carter. "It's nice to finally meet you, Mrs. When you want us." "E. Williams." "Missy," she corrected automatically. "Sophie talks about you constantly." The dragon anatomy lessons have been particularly educational. Was that amusement in her tone? Elijah couldn't quite tell. "Mom, Elijah knows about everything," Sophie interjected. "Stars and math and why blood is red and how to make volcanoes with baking soda." "Impressive range," Mrs. Williams commented, her expression warming slightly. "Sophie's an exceptional student," Elijah replied honestly. "Makes my job easy. He doesn't talk to me like I'm stupid," Sophie added with the bluntness of childhood. "And he doesn't mind when I have bad days." Something flickered across Ms. Williams' face, gratitude perhaps, or relief. "That's wonderful to hear." She glanced at her watch. "I have some calls to make, but I'll be staying tonight. Thank you for coming despite circumstances." Elijah recognized the polite dismissal. "Of course. I'll see you Friday, Sophie. Maybe we can start that solar system model we talked about." Sophie nodded eagerly, then winced at the movement. As he packed up his books, Ms. Williams walked him to the door. In the hallway, away from Sophie's ears, her professional demeanor returned. "Doctor, Kim speaks highly of you," she said. It's not easy to engage Sophie when she's in pain. "She's remarkable," Elijah replied simply. Most kids would be focused only on how they feel. "She still wants to learn no matter what." Mrs. Williams studied him with that same unsettlingly perceptive gaze. "Your professor mentioned you're working on your master's in education?" "Yes, focusing on accessible teaching methods for children with physical disabilities or chronic illnesses." She nodded, seeming to come to some decision. "Sophie's condition can be unpredictable. There may be times when our schedule changes suddenly, especially if I'm called away for work. I hope that won't be a problem." "Not at all," Elijah assured her. "My schedule's flexible." "And good." She reached into her purse and handed him a business card. "My direct number. If you need anything for Sophie's lessons, books, supplies, whatever helps, just let me know." The card was simple but elegant, reading only Elizabeth Williams, with a phone number. No company name, no title. He pocketed it with a nod. "Thank you, Mrs. Williams." As he walked away, he could feel her watching him, her gaze a tangible weight between his shoulder blades. 2 months into tutoring Sophie, Elijah's financial situation reached a breaking point. An unexpected increase in his utility bill coincided with a reduction in his library hours due to spring break. The careful balance he'd maintained tipped dangerously. He sat in his apartment, staring at the final notice for his electricity bill, calculating how many meals he could skip to make up the difference. His scholarship wouldn't disperse for another 3 weeks, and his next paycheck from the library wouldn't cover both this and rent. The tutoring money helped, but with Sophie's health improving, their sessions had become less frequent as she began attending school part-time. His phone buzzed with a text from Nancy. "Sophie having a good week. No tutoring needed until next Monday. Another session canceled." He closed his eyes, pushing down the panic rising in his chest. He'd figure it out. He always did. His gaze fell on the business card Ms. Williams had given him weeks ago. She'd said to contact her if he needed anything for Sophie's lessons. He'd never taken her up on the offer, preferring to create learning materials from what he already had or could borrow from the university. But now, with Sophie's interest in astronomy growing, maybe he could suggest a planetarium visit. The educational value was undeniable, and if Ms. Williams approved the expense. Before he could talk himself out of it, he typed a message. "Miss Williams, this is Elijah Carter. Sophie has shown significant interest in astronomy. Would you consider approving a field trip to the Museum of Science Planetarium next week? The educational value would be substantial." The response came faster than expected. "Approved. Good idea. Sophie will be thrilled. Details." Relieved, he outlined his plan. Museum admission, planetarium show, and a hands-on workshop they offered for young scientists. He hesitated before adding, "Total cost approximately $120 for tickets and materials. I can submit receipts afterward." "No need," came the reply. "I'll have Nancy give you $200 on Friday. Use the extra for lunch and any other materials you think would enhance the experience." Elijah stared at the message, a complex mix of relief and discomfort washing over him. The extra money would cover part of his electricity bill, but it felt wrong somehow, like he was taking advantage. After a moment's consideration, he typed, "Thank you, but $120 is sufficient. I appreciate your support of Sophie's education." The 3 dots indicating Ms. Williams was typing appeared and disappeared several times before her reply came through. "Very well. $120 it is." When Friday arrived, Nancy handed him an envelope. "From Miss Cernas. Williams," she said with a knowing smile. Inside was $200 in cash and a note in elegant handwriting. "For Sophie's education. No receipts necessary." Elijah's throat tightened. He should return the extra money. It was the right thing to do. But the final notice for his electricity bill flashed in his mind, along with the image of his refrigerator's increasingly empty shelves. He tucked the envelope into his pocket, promising himself he would make the planetarium trip extra special to justify the additional funds. The Monday of the planetarium trip dawned clear and cold. Elijah arrived at Sophie's house early, carrying a backpack filled with materials for their day. A notebook for Sophie to record observations, colored pencils for drawing what she saw, and reference cards he'd created with interesting facts about each planet. Sophie was waiting by the window, practically vibrating with excitement. She wore jeans and a sweater, a rare sight as her condition usually made soft, loose clothing more comfortable. "Are we really going to see stars in the daytime?" she asked as soon as he entered. "Something like that." He smiled. "The planetarium projects the night sky onto a dome ceiling. It's like being outside at night, but we can speed up time and see how stars move or zoom in on different planets." Nancy helped Sophie with her coat and backpack, reviewing medication schedules and emergency contacts with Elijah. Miss Williams had apparently left at dawn for a business trip to Chicago, but had called Sophie that morning to wish her a good time. The museum was busy with school groups, but Sophie didn't seem bothered by the crowds. If anything, she appeared energized by the activity around her, pointing excitedly at exhibits and rattling off facts she'd learned during their lessons. "Jupiter has 79 moons that we know about," she informed a startled museum docent who had merely greeted them at the entrance to the space exhibit. "But probably more we haven't found yet." The planetarium show left her speechless, a rare event. In the darkened dome, as stars bloomed overhead and galaxies swirled around them, Elijah glanced over to see Sophie's face transformed with wonder, her eyes reflecting the projected cosmos. "It's like being inside the universe," she whispered, reaching unconsciously for his hand. The small, warm fingers, curling trustingly into his palm, created an unexpected lump in his throat. For a moment, he was 8 years old again, sitting beside his father at their first planetarium visit, experiencing that same sense of vastness and possibility. After the show, they explored the hands-on exhibits. Sophie's energy seemed inexhaustible as she moved from station to station, her earlier physical discomfort apparently forgotten in her excitement. By lunchtime, however, Elijah noticed the signs of fatigue setting in, a slight stiffness in her movements, the way she leaned against exhibits when she thought no one was watching. "Refueling time for scientists," he announced, steering them toward the museum cafe. Over sandwiches and apple juice, Sophie grew quieter, the morning's exertions catching up with her. "Are you doing okay?" Elijah asked gently. "We can head back after lunch if you're tired." She shook her head stubbornly. "I want to see everything. Mom said I could." "We can come back another day too," he suggested. "The museum isn't going anywhere." Sophie poked at her sandwich, not meeting his eyes. "But you might be..." The simple statement caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "My other tutors all left. And Dad left. People always leave eventually." The matter-of-fact way she said it made his heart clench. "Sophie, it's okay," she interrupted with a shrug too practiced for her years. "Mom says it's just how life works. People have their own lives and priorities." Elijah set down his sandwich, choosing his words carefully. "That's sometimes true, but it doesn't mean people leave because of you, and it doesn't mean everyone leaves." "Mom never leaves," Sophie acknowledged, "but she's always really busy. That's why she has to travel so much. She's important." "What does your mom do?" Elijah asked, realizing he still didn't know after all these weeks. "She runs a company. She makes medicine and machines that help sick people." Sophie took a sip of her juice. "She's trying to make medicine for kids like me too, but it's complicated." "A pharmaceutical company then." That explained the comfortable but not lavish lifestyle. Executive level, perhaps, given the travel demands. "That sounds like important work." Elijah agreed. "Is that why you're interested in science? Because of your mom?" Sophie considered this. "Partly, but mostly because I want to understand why my body doesn't work right. If I understand it, maybe I can fix it someday." The simple determination in her voice struck him deeply. Here was a child facing daily pain and limitations, channeling her experience into curiosity rather than bitterness. "That's exactly how science works," he told her. "Understanding first, then solutions." She smiled at him, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Can we see the dinosaurs after lunch? Before we go home?" "Absolutely." They spent another hour exploring the dinosaur exhibit, with Sophie's energy resurging enough for her to enthusiastically explain to Elijah why the velociraptor display was inaccurate. "They had feathers in real life. This looks like a giant lizard." By the time they returned to Sophie's house, she was exhausted but glowing with satisfaction. Nancy helped her upstairs for a nap, while Elijah gathered their educational materials from the day. "She'll be talking about this for weeks," Nancy said when she returned. "It's good to see her so excited about something. She's an incredible kid." Elijah replied, "Smart, resilient, stubborn as a mule," Nancy added with affection. "Just like her mother." Elijah hesitated, then asked the question that had been nagging him. "Nancy, what exactly does Miss Williams do?" Sophie mentioned something about medicine and machines. Nancy's expression shifted subtly. "Elizabeth is the founder and CEO of Williams Biomedical. They're one of the leading medical technology companies in the country." The information landed like a physical blow. Williams Biomedical was no mid-sized pharmaceutical company. It was a biotech giant, regularly featured in business publications, known for cutting-edge medical devices and innovative treatments. Which meant Elizabeth Williams wasn't just some executive. She was the Elizabeth Williams, whose net worth was estimated in the billions. And he had agonized over accepting an extra $80 from her. "You didn't know?" Nancy asked, observing his expression. "No," he admitted. "Sophie just said her mom was important and busy." Nancy smiled. "That sounds like Sophie, focused on what matters to her." Elizabeth is quite private about their personal life. After what happened with Sophie's father, she stopped herself. "Well, that's not my story to tell." "Of course," Elijah said quickly. "I was just curious." As he walked home, his mind spun with the revelation. Elizabeth Williams, CEO of a biotech empire, was entrusting her daughter's education to a broke graduate student who counted pretzels and slept in his coat when the heat failed. The irony wasn't lost on him, and yet Sophie had never mentioned her mother's wealth or status. To her, mom was just mom, important because she made medicine and never left, not because of her bank account. That night, as Elijah heated a can of soup on his temperamental stove, his phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. How was the planetarium? E. Williams. He stared at the message, suddenly seeing it in a new light. Not just a mother checking on her daughter's day, but one of the most powerful women in the medical industry taking time to text a tutor. After careful consideration, he replied, Sophie had a wonderful time. She particularly enjoyed the planetarium show and correcting the museum about featherless velociraptors. She was tired afterward, but very happy. The response came quickly. Sounds like Sophie. Thank you for giving her a normal day. Those are rare and precious. The simple gratitude in the message struck him. For all her wealth and power, Elizabeth Williams wanted for her daughter what any parent would: moments of joy and normalcy in the midst of chronic illness. Before he could overthink it, he typed, "It was my pleasure." She's an extraordinary child with a brilliant mind. Her questions about space travel led to an impromptu physics lesson that I think even some of my graduate classmates would have struggled with. 3 dots appeared and disappeared several times before her response arrived. She gets that from her father. The curiosity without limits. Thank you for nurturing it instead of shutting it down. Elijah sensed a story there, but knew better than to pry. Instead, he sent, "That's what good teaching is all about. Fostering curiosity, not containing it." Indeed. Good night, Mr. Sir Carter. Good night, Mrs. Williams. He set his phone down, the soup forgotten as he processed the day's revelations. Somehow, knowing that Sophie was the daughter of a billionaire CEO made her quiet courage even more remarkable. She could have been entitled or demanding, expecting the world to accommodate her every whim. Instead, she counted his pretzels and worried that people would leave her. The next morning, Elijah received an email from his university's financial aid office. An anonymous donor had established a new scholarship for graduate students in education, focusing on accessible teaching methods. He had been selected as the first recipient. The award would cover his remaining tuition and included a stipend for living expenses. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. His first instinct was pride, a reflexive need to decline what felt like charity. But as he reread the email, a different perspective emerged. If Elizabeth Williams was indeed behind this, she wasn't offering him charity. She was investing in someone who was helping her daughter. It was a business decision in a way, ensuring Sophie's tutor could focus on teaching rather than financial survival. After long consideration, he sent a simple text. "Thank you for the scholarship opportunity. I assume you had something to do with it." Her reply came hours later. "I believe in investing in exceptional educators. Your work with Sophie demonstrates your potential. The scholarship committee made their selection based on merit. Your acceptance honors my daughter and other children who will benefit from your teaching methods." It was diplomatically worded but clear. She had created an opportunity, but his qualifications had earned it. With a deep breath, he typed, "Then I accept with gratitude and will work to justify the committee's faith in me." "I have no doubt you will." "Sophie has tutoring tomorrow?" "Yes, 2 p.m. We're starting a unit on marine biology at her request." "Excellent. I'll be joining you. I have some materials that might be helpful." Elijah's stomach tightened at the prospect of teaching under the watchful eye of Elizabeth Williams. But he reminded himself that regardless of her wealth or status, she was simply a mother concerned about her child's education. The following afternoon, he arrived at Sophie's house to find not just Sophie and Elizabeth waiting, but a living room transformed into an oceanic wonderland. A professional-grade digital projector displayed high-definition underwater footage across one wall. Glass tanks of varying sizes contained specimens ranging from starfish to small tropical fish. Educational models of whales and deep-sea creatures sat on the coffee table alongside museum-quality books on marine biology. "Elijah!" Sophie called from where she sat cross-legged on the floor, examining something in a petri dish. "Mom brought the ocean to us. Look at this plankton under the microscope." Elizabeth Williams, dressed more casually than he'd seen her before in jeans and a simple blue sweater, stood to greet him. Without the formal business attire, she looked younger, more approachable, though still with that aura of contained energy and sharp intelligence. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "Sophie mentioned your next unit, and I had some resources available through the company's marine research division." Some resources. The equipment filling the room would be the envy of most university labs. "This is incredible," he managed, taking in the impromptu marine laboratory. "Though I had planned to start with basics like ocean zones and simple ecosystems." A flicker of embarrassment crossed her face. "I may have gotten carried away. It's a professional hazard. Access to too many resources and not enough restraint in using them." The admission, self-deprecating and honest, caught him off guard. It humanized her in a way their previous brief interactions hadn't. "We can adapt," he assured her. Actually, having real specimens will make the concepts much more concrete for Sophie. Relief softened her features. "That's what I hoped. I don't get to participate in her education as much as I'd like." For the next 2 hours, Elijah led a lesson that incorporated Elizabeth's materials while maintaining his original educational objectives. To his surprise, Elizabeth participated not as an observer, but as a student alongside Sophie, asking questions and offering insights only when relevant to the lesson. Her knowledge of marine biology was substantial, clearly the result of genuine interest rather than superficial research. When Sophie began to tire, Elizabeth noticed before Elijah did, smoothly suggesting a break for snacks that gave her daughter rest without making it about her limitations. As Sophie sat at the kitchen table with Nancy, carefully feeding the tropical fish, Elizabeth pulled Elijah aside. "Thank you for adapting so gracefully to my overzealous preparation," she said quietly. "I sometimes compensate for my absences with excess." Sophie clearly loved it. Elijah replied honestly, and it made the lesson more impactful. She studied him with that penetrating gaze. "You're very diplomatic, Mr. Carter." "Elijah, please. And I'm not being diplomatic, just truthful. Your contributions enhance the lesson, though I'm curious how you arranged all this on such short notice." A smile touched her lips. "When you run a company with a marine research division studying oceanic microorganisms for pharmaceutical applications, certain resources are a phone call away." She paused. "Though I admit the projector came from our home theater system." "Ah, of course. Doesn't everyone have a spare IMAX projector lying around?" he teased before he could stop himself. To his relief, she laughed, a genuine sound that transformed her face. "Touché. I deserve that." They shared a moment of unexpected camaraderie before Sophie called for them to see how the fish were responding to different light conditions. After the lesson concluded, as Elijah packed up his teaching materials, Elizabeth walked him to the door. "Sophie's standardized test scores came back yesterday," she said. "Despite missing nearly half the school year, she's testing 2 grade levels above in science and mathematics. Her reading comprehension has improved significantly as well." Pride warmed Elijah's chest. "That's wonderful news. She works incredibly hard. Her previous tutors saw only limitations. You see possibilities." Elizabeth hesitated, then added, "Her father was the same way, always looking beyond conventional boundaries." It was the second time she'd mentioned Sophie's father in a positive light, despite his absence from their lives. "May I ask what happened? With Sophie's father?" The question slipped out before he could reconsider. Elizabeth's expression closed, professional reserve sliding back into place. Then, seemingly coming to a decision, she said, "Walk with me a moment." They stepped outside into the spring afternoon, following a stone path that wound through the modest backyard. Birds chirped in the flowering dogwood trees, and new grass pushed through the soil in vibrant green patches. "Daniel was a brilliant scientist," Elizabeth began, her voice measured. "We met at MIT when I was developing the business plan for Williams Biomedical, and he was completing his PhD in biochemistry. He became our first research director." Her lips curved in a faint smile. "He was everything I wasn't. Idealistic, spontaneous, more interested in discovery than commercialization." She paused at a small garden bench, brushing her fingers over its weathered wood surface. "When Sophie was diagnosed at 4, he took it harder than I did. I approached it as a problem to solve. Treatments, specialists, research initiatives. Daniel saw the pain it caused her, and it broke something in him." Elijah remained silent, sensing she rarely shared this story. He began working obsessively on treatments for juvenile arthritis, sometimes sleeping in the lab for days. When traditional approaches yielded limited results, he pushed for experimental methods that our ethics board wouldn't approve. Her voice tightened. We argued about the research, about Sophie's treatment plan, about work-life balance. He left the company. Then he left us. "I'm sorry," Elijah said quietly. She shook her head. "He sends birthday and Christmas gifts, calls on holidays." But he couldn't reconcile his vision of the perfect, healthy child with Sophie's reality. A hint of steel entered her voice. His loss. "She's perfect exactly as she is." "Yes," Elijah agreed simply. "She is." Elizabeth looked at him then, really looked at him, with an intensity that made him acutely aware of her presence beside him on the garden path. Not as a CEO or billionaire, but as a mother fiercely protective of her daughter. "You remind me of him sometimes," she said softly. "The good parts." The curiosity, the way you see connections between seemingly unrelated things. But you have something he lacked: acceptance of reality alongside the vision of possibility. The comparison to a man who had abandoned his child, however flattering in some respects, made Elijah uncomfortable. "I just try to be the teacher Sophie needs." "You're succeeding." She straightened, professional demeanor returning. "I've kept you too long. Thank you again for today's lesson." As he walked to the bus stop, Elijah reflected on the glimpse behind Elizabeth Williams' carefully constructed public persona. The woman who had built a biotech empire was also a mother who compensated for business trips with elaborate marine biology displays, who defended her daughter's perfection with quiet ferocity. The realization that he found both versions equally compelling was something he decided not to examine too closely. Spring melted into early summer. Sophie's health stabilized enough for her to attend school 3 days a week, reducing their tutoring sessions to twice weekly. The scholarship freed Elijah to cut back his library hours, giving him more time for his thesis research, which increasingly focused on educational approaches for children with chronic illnesses, inspired by his work with Sophie. Elizabeth joined their lessons more frequently when her schedule allowed, her initial reserve gradually warming into genuine engagement. She never again overwhelmed them with excessive resources, instead asking Elijah beforehand what might enhance each lesson. Their text exchanges, initially focused solely on Sophie's education, began to include occasional personal notes. She recommended articles relevant to his research. He suggested books Sophie might enjoy that Elizabeth could read with her during business trips. In late May, as the academic year wound down, Elizabeth invited him to Sophie's end-of-year science presentation at school. The project, an interactive model of the solar system that incorporated elements from their planetarium visit months earlier, had earned Sophie special recognition from her teachers. "You should be there," Elizabeth texted. "This wouldn't have happened without you." The school auditorium was filled with proud parents and restless siblings when Elijah arrived. He spotted Elizabeth immediately, standing apart from the clusters of chatting adults, reviewing something on her phone. She wore a simple dress rather than her usual business attire, but still carried herself with that unmistakable air of authority that seemed to create a bubble of space around her. She looked up as he approached, her expression warming. "You came. I wouldn't miss it," he replied honestly. "How's she feeling today?" "Nervous but determined. A good health day, fortunately." Elizabeth glanced around at the other parents. She wanted to invite Nancy too, but only 2 guests were allowed per student. The implication that Elizabeth had chosen him over Sophie's longtime nurse wasn't lost on Elijah. Before he could respond, the presentations began. Sophie was third to present. She walked to the front with a slight limp, but stood tall as she unveiled her project. A scale model of the solar system where each planet contained information not just about its physical properties, but also about how human physiology would be affected by its unique environment. "On Jupiter, the gravity would crush your bones," she explained to her wide-eyed classmates. "But on Mars, you could jump 3 times higher than on Earth because the gravity is weaker." As she continued her presentation, connecting astronomy to human biology with connections that showed sophisticated understanding of both, Elijah felt a surge of pride so intense it caught him by surprise. Beside him, Elizabeth watched with shining eyes, her usual composure softened by maternal pride. When Sophie concluded to enthusiastic applause, she looked out into the audience. Her face lit up as she spotted them, and she gave a small, excited wave. "She's remarkable," Elijah said quietly. "Yes," Elizabeth agreed, the single word filled with emotion. "She is." After the presentations, as they waited for Sophie to gather her things, Elizabeth turned to him. "Would you join us for dinner? Sophie wants to celebrate, and your presence would make it special for her." The invitation, casual yet significant, hung between them. "I'd be honored," he replied. Dinner was at a small Italian restaurant where the owner greeted Elizabeth by name and led them to a quiet corner table. Sophie, excited by her success and the special occasion, dominated the conversation, describing her classmates' reactions to her project and her teacher's comments. It felt strangely comfortable, the 3 of them sharing a meal, responding to Sophie's enthusiasm, exchanging glances of amusement at her more dramatic declarations. If anyone observing them thought they looked like a family, Elijah firmly pushed the thought away. As Sophie finished her gelato, Elizabeth's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her expression shifting subtly before she silenced it and returned it to her purse. "Everything okay?" Elijah asked. "Just work," she replied with a dismissive wave. "Nothing that can't wait until tomorrow." Sophie looked up sharply. Is it about the new medicine? Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. The clinical trial results came in. But tonight is about your achievement, not my work. But your work helps kids like me, Sophie insisted. That's more important than my silly project. Nothing about you is silly, Elizabeth said firmly. And nothing is more important to me than you. The results will still be there tomorrow. Sophie considered this, then nodded, apparently satisfied. But Elijah noticed how her small hand reached for her mother's, squeezing it briefly before returning to her spoon. After dinner, as they waited for the valet to bring Elizabeth's car, Sophie's energy finally flagged. She leaned against her mother, eyelids drooping. I think someone's ready for bed, Elizabeth said softly, stroking her daughter's curls. Not tired, Sophie protested through a yawn. Just resting my eyes. Elizabeth and Elijah exchanged smiles over her head. When the car arrived, Elizabeth helped Sophie into the back seat, where she promptly curled up against the door. Can we drop you somewhere? Elizabeth asked Elijah. He hesitated, acutely aware of the contrast between his apartment in the struggling part of town and the evening they'd just shared. The tea station is fine. She raised an eyebrow. It's nearly 10 o'clock. Let us take you home. The gentle insistence in her voice made refusal difficult. Thank you. I'm near Packard's Corner. The drive was quiet. Sophie's soft breathing from the back seat, the only sound until Elizabeth spoke. The trial results, she said, her voice low enough not to wake her daughter. They're promising. A new treatment for juvenile arthritis that reduces inflammation without the immune suppression of current therapies. That's incredible, Elijah replied, understanding the significance for children like Sophie. Yes, she agreed, but still years from market, even with accelerated approval pathways. She glanced in the rearview mirror at her sleeping daughter. Science moves too slowly sometimes. The vulnerability in her voice, the rare admission of frustration from a woman who projected nothing but confident capability, touched something in Elijah. But it moves, he said gently. And in the meantime, Sophie has you fighting for her and with her. That matters more than you know. Elizabeth's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Some days I wonder if Daniel was right. If I spend too much time trying to fix the future and not enough living in the present with her. From what I've seen, you're doing both, Elijah said. And Sophie knows it. The way she talks about your work, she's proud of you. Elizabeth fell silent, but in the dim light of passing street lamps, he thought he saw her blink rapidly. They arrived at his apartment building, the shabby facade even more apparent next to her sleek luxury sedan. Elijah expected discomfort or awkwardness, but Elizabeth showed no reaction to the neighborhood's obvious economic struggles. Thank you for today, she said as he opened the car door. For being there for Sophie? She hesitated. For seeing us both clearly. The statement, cryptic yet deeply personal, hung between them. Before Elijah could formulate a response, Sophie stirred in the back seat, murmuring something in her sleep. Good night, Elizabeth, he said quietly, using her first name for the first time. Her lips curved in a small smile. Good night, Elijah. As June approached, bringing with it the end of the school year and the completion of Elijah's tutoring arrangement, an unspoken tension built between him and Elizabeth. Their text exchanges became more frequent, but more careful, circling around the question of what would happen once his official role in Sophie's education concluded. Sophie herself seemed increasingly anxious, asking repeatedly if he would be her tutor again the following year. We'll see, was all he could say, not wanting to make promises he couldn't keep. The truth was more complicated than he could explain to an 8-year-old. His thesis would be complete by December, after which he hoped to secure a teaching position, possibly at a hospital-affiliated school where he could work with children like Sophie. But even if he remained in Boston, continuing as Sophie's tutor raised questions about boundaries and expectations that he wasn't sure how to navigate, especially given his growing awareness of his feelings for Elizabeth. The matter came to a head during their final scheduled session in mid-June. Sophie was having a difficult day, her joints inflamed enough to make writing painful. Instead of their planned lesson, they sat in the backyard, identifying cloud formations and discussing the water cycle. Will you be my teacher forever? Sophie asked suddenly, her voice small against the backdrop of birdsong and distant traffic. Elijah chose his words carefully. I won't be your official tutor after today, but I'll always be someone who cares about you and your education. Sophie frowned, not satisfied with the diplomatic answer. But will I see you, or will you disappear like Dad did? The question hit like a physical blow. Sophie, that's very different. Your dad is your dad, no matter where he lives or how often you see him. I'm your tutor, You're more than that, she insisted with a child's certainty. You're my friend. And Mom smiles more when you're here. Elijah felt heat rise in his face. Your mom and I are interested colleagues. We both care about your education. Sophie rolled her eyes dramatically. Grown-ups always make simple things complicated. Before Elijah could respond, the back door opened and Elizabeth emerged from the house. She had returned early from a business trip to be present for their final session, but had been on conference calls since her arrival. How's the lesson going? She asked, joining them on the grass. It's not a lesson. We're cloud watching because my hands hurt, Sophie said matter-of-factly. And Elijah won't promise to stay forever, even though he wants to. Elizabeth's eyes widened slightly. Sophie, it's true. He likes being here with us. And you like having him here. Sophie looked between them with exasperation. Why can't he just stay? An uncomfortable silence fell. Elijah stared at the grass, acutely aware of Elizabeth beside him, her presence both comforting and unsettling. Finally, Elizabeth spoke. Sophie, honey, remember our talk about professional relationships? Elijah was hired to be your tutor for a specific time period. But that's just paper stuff, Sophie protested. In real life, he's part of our family now. The simple declaration hung in the air, both heartwarming and heartbreaking in its childish certainty. Elizabeth stood, reaching for Sophie's hand. I think we need to give Elijah some space. Let's go inside and get your medication. Nancy made lemonade earlier. Sophie allowed herself to be led away, though not without a backwards glance at Elijah that contained equal parts accusation and plea. When Elizabeth returned a few minutes later, she found him still sitting on the grass, staring at the clouds drifting overhead. I'm sorry about that, she said, settling beside him. She's been anxious about endings lately. Her therapist says it's normal, given her history with her father. Elijah nodded. I understand. I just don't know how to make this easier for her. You can't, Elizabeth replied simply. That's part of growing up. Learning that relationships change, that people come and go from our lives in different capacities. She paused. Though in this case, I hope the relationship isn't ending entirely. He turned to look at her, searching her face for her meaning. What are you suggesting? She met his gaze steadily. Sophie loves you, not just as a tutor, but as someone who sees her wholly, her brilliance and her struggles, her courage and her fears. I won't ask you to continue as her tutor if your career takes you elsewhere, but I hope you'll remain in her life in some capacity. The careful phrasing, focusing on Sophie, avoiding any mention of her own feelings, told Elijah as much by what was unsaid as what was expressed. And what about you? He asked quietly. What do you want? Elizabeth looked away, her composure faltering briefly. What I want is complicated by who I am. My position, my responsibilities, my history. I'm not asking the CEO of Williams Biomedical, Elijah said gently. I'm asking Elizabeth, Sophie's mother, the woman who brings Ocean Laboratories into her living room and skips reading clinical trial results to celebrate her daughter's science project. A smile touched her lips. That Elizabeth wants, she hesitated, then continued with careful precision, that Elizabeth values your presence in our lives beyond your professional role. She finds your perspective refreshing, your principles admirable, and your company increasingly essential. The measured admission, so characteristically restrained yet unmistakably sincere, touched Elijah deeply. I feel the same way, he replied simply, about both of you. She turned to him then, her professional reserve giving way to something more vulnerable and real. I don't know how to do this, Elijah. My world is corporate boardrooms and research laboratories. Dating isn't exactly on my calendar between FDA meetings and investor calls. Dating? He echoed, unable to suppress a smile at her business-like approach to the concept. She flushed slightly. Isn't that what we're discussing? Or have I completely misread the situation? No, he assured her quickly. You haven't misread anything. I just didn't expect you to be so direct. Direct is efficient, she replied, a hint of humor in her eyes. And at my age, with my responsibilities, efficiency matters. Elijah laughed, the tension between them easing. All right then, let's be efficient. I care about you and Sophie. My tutoring contract ends today, but I'd like to remain in your lives in whatever capacity makes sense for all of us. Elizabeth studied him, her analytical mind visibly processing possibilities and implications. It won't be simple. My life comes with complications, public scrutiny, security concerns, travel demands, and Sophie's condition requires flexibility and understanding. I'm aware, he said quietly, And still here. She nodded, decision made. Then we'll figure it out. Step by step. From inside the house came the sound of Sophie calling for them. Elizabeth rose gracefully, extending her hand to help Elijah up. Their fingers remained entwined for a moment longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgement of the boundary they had just crossed. Mom! Elijah! Come see what Nancy and I made. Sophie's voice carried across the yard. Coming, Elizabeth called back. Before they moved toward the house, she turned to Elijah once more. Whatever happens between us, Sophie comes first. Always. I wouldn't have it any other way, he replied with absolute certainty. Inside, they found Sophie and Nancy in the kitchen, surrounded by what appeared to be the components of a volcano science project: baking soda, vinegar, food coloring, and a clay mountain on a cookie sheet. We're making a surprise for you, Sophie announced, her earlier distress forgotten in the excitement of creation. Because it's our last official lesson day. This looks impressive, Elijah said, examining the detailed mountain Sophie had sculpted despite her painful hands. Nancy helped with the hard parts, Sophie admitted. But I did the design. It's Mount St. Helens. We learned about it in school. As they gathered around the kitchen island to witness the eruption, Sophie carefully measuring vinegar, while Nancy added food coloring to the baking soda, Elijah felt Elizabeth's shoulder press lightly against his, a small point of contact, deliberate and meaningful. The volcano erupted with appropriate drama, red lava, flowing down its sides and across the cookie sheet, while Sophie provided enthusiastic sound effects. In the midst of the controlled chaos, with Sophie's laughter filling the kitchen and Elizabeth's quiet presence beside him, Elijah felt a sense of rightness, of belonging, that had nothing to do with tutoring contracts or professional obligations. Again, Sophie demanded as the eruption subsided. Let's make it bigger this time. One volcanic disaster per day is plenty, Nancy said firmly, already reaching for paper towels. But Elijah might not come back after today, Sophie protested, her earlier worry resurfacing. We need to make it special. Elizabeth and Elijah exchanged glances. Actually, Elizabeth said carefully, I've been thinking that perhaps Elijah might join us for dinner regularly, even after your tutoring ends. Would you like that? Sophie's face lit up. Like a standing play date? Something like that. Elizabeth replied, her eyes meeting Elijah's over Sophie's head. Every week? Sophie pressed, sensing an advantage. Let's start with once a week and see how everyone's schedule works out, Elizabeth suggested diplomatically. Sophie considered this, then nodded sagely. That's acceptable, but he has to come to my birthday party too. And Christmas. And maybe Thanksgiving. I think that's Elijah's decision, Elizabeth said, a hint of amusement in her voice. 3 pairs of eyes turned to him, Sophie's hopeful, Nancy's knowing, Elizabeth's quietly questioning. In that moment, looking at the volcano-making chaos and the small family that had somehow become central to his life, Elijah made the easiest decision of his life. I would be honored, he said simply. For all of it, Sophie's triumphant smile was worth every moment of uncertainty that had preceded it. She threw her arms around him in a fierce hug, volcano forgotten. Over her head, Elijah's eyes met Elizabeth's. In her gaze, he saw not the billionaire CEO or even the fiercely protective mother, but simply a woman opening her heart to possibility, just as he was opening his. A poor student had tutored a sick child for free, only to learn she was the CEO's daughter. But what he truly discovered was something far more valuable: a family, a purpose, and a love that no amount of money could buy or measure. As Sophie released him to return to her volcano, chattering excitedly about their future dinners and her birthday plans, Elizabeth moved to stand beside him. Her hand found his, fingers intertwining with quiet certainty. Thank you, she whispered, for seeing us, really seeing us, from the very beginning. Elijah squeezed her hand gently. Some lessons, he replied softly, are worth learning again and again.